March 8th marked International Women's Day. Throughout the country and the world, many celebrated and shared stories on social media about influential women in their lives. Women have always had an impact on the world, but many of their stories from an earlier era are untold because of the social climate women lived in. Women of Lackawanna County have had some of their own powerful stories. Professor of Art History at the University of Scranton, Dr. Josephine Dunn is an expert on women of Scranton. She created a book entitled Women of Scranton, 1880 to 1935, which shows a collection of images of women from the Scranton area from this time period.
I began researching women and history in northeastern Pennsylvania about, I think now probably about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe even longer. And I did it because I was frustrated, quite frankly. It seemed that every time we celebrated anything in Scranton, it always had to do with coal, or railroads, or strikes, or industry. And it just seemed to me there must have been another story here. And as I researched the women, I began to see that there was an entire women's history in Scranton that no one had ever talked about or published on, or it was just this huge, huge hole.
So what exactly took place during this hall? Dr. Dunn discussed the role of women of Scranton and women's suffrage in Pennsylvania.
Well, I wondered when the suffrage story started here, because as I was going through the late 1890s newspapers, I was looking for any sense that women here were organizing as a group or beginning to work on suffrage, because after all, the entire women's movement began in the 1840s, 1848 with Seneca Falls, so I thought surely there had to have been some activity here. But you have to remember that Scranton didn't really take off as a city that drew a lot of people until after the Civil War. So, but I thought still probably in the 1880s and 90s there could have been something, but I'm finding very little. I found very little until I hit the year 1913. And in that year it seemed like everything began to pop for suffrage in Scranton, and it had to do a lot with one woman, Kate Ryan Chapman.
According to Dr. Dunn, Kate Ryan Chapman was a well-spoken, sassy, extremely knowledgeable woman with a mission. She said she played a large role in advocacy for women's suffrage. Dr. Dunn told the story of the impact of women of Scranton on a 1913 election.
In 1913, there was the referendum on suffrage came up, and every woman in Pennsylvania knew that it was going to be a close call in the Senate. The House voted overwhelmingly that there should be a constitutional amendment for suffrage, but the Senate was a little tougher nut to crack. And one of the senators holding out with a no was the senator from Lackawanna County. Now, that's basically about all Kate Ryan Chapman needed to know. She organized, she did everything she could to fill his desk with letters saying we want this resolution passed. And the vote in the Senate, the first vote in the Senate, was a tie. And so the lieutenant governor had to step in and say, okay, we're going to postpone the vote until 4-6 senators get well and we can have our requisite number. Well, the no side in the Senate pushed to have an earlier referendum vote. They wanted to do it when they still thought they had the numbers. They didn't succeed in that. The referendum was called, and again, it was a tie. The third time was the charm. Kate Ryan Chapman leaned on the Lackawanna senator. He is reported in the paper as saying, I absolutely will not vote for it. I do not think this is right. I do not think women should vote. But my constituents forced me to do this. And he ended up, the Lackawanna senator ended up casting the vote that broke the tie. So in 1913, Pennsylvania was for the referendum. Kate Ryan Chapman took the credit for this vote, and because of it, the Equal Suffrage League honored her by choosing Scranton as the site of their next big convention in 1914. So in 1914, Scranton was filled with Pennsylvania suffragettes.
This is an image from a 1914 Pennsylvania convention for women's suffrage hosted at the Hotel Casey in Scranton. Dr. Dunn explained that in Pennsylvania, the resolution had to pass 2 successive sessions. In 1915, the second vote on the referendum was defeated. However, by 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. Women finally had the right to vote in America. If it weren't for the passion and efforts of women like those from Scranton and throughout America, this might not have ever happened. Dr. Dunn hopes that the search for women's history in Lackawanna County continues and urges students who are passionate about the subject to start digging.
And look in strange places, because that's where you're going to find the history of the women of Scranton. It's not going to be on a bookshelf waiting for you to read. You've got to be out there digging through attics, basements, you name it.